So our question is, why do we have to finish the matzah by midnight? If, based on the Haggadah, the whole reason that we have matzah is because of something that happened after midnight, because Hashem revealed himself, and that was such a powerful experience that not only did they rush, and that's why their dough didn't rise, but it wasn't possible to rise. There's no space for inflation. There's no space for expansion when Hashem reveals himself. So that's the reason we eat the matzah, as we read in the Haggadah. We say the reason we're eating this matzah is because Hashem revealed himself to the Jewish people, and that, so to speak, contained the possibility of ego, and therefore contained the possibility of chometz. So if that's why we're eating the matzah, why do we have to finish it before midnight if the whole cause of matzah happened after midnight at the original Pesach? So let's understand what's the difference between matzah before midnight and matzah after midnight. And I'm not talking about the actual matzah, because it will be exactly the same before and after midnight. The question is rather from a spiritual perspective. What does it represent? In other words, if you go back to the original story, the matzah that they ate before midnight, how did they have that matzah? Because they had their little Pesach sacrifice in anticipation of leaving Egypt. So the matzah that they ate that night, where did it come from? How did they have it? They made it. They prepared it. The matzah that they ate the next day, how did they have that matzah?
Left over.
Because what?
Left over.
No? You're not allowed to have matzah. Well, you could. Matzah you could have leftover. What?
Pre-made.
No? How did they have matzah the next day? Because Hashem revealed himself, and therefore the chometz wasn't able to become matzah. In other words, the matzah from before midnight is matzah of human effort. The matzah after midnight is matzah from Hashem's intervention. So there are two kinds of matzah over here, which really represents that, because we know that matzah represents humility and chometz represents the potential for ego, so that really means there are two kinds of humility that exist. There's a kind of humility that exists because I work on myself to be a more humble person. That's represented by the matzah that you make before midnight. And then there's the kind of humility which is the result of the fact that Hashem does the work. And Hashem can easily do something that humbles us as people. So the question is, which is greater? Is it greater when the work is done by us, or when the work is done by Hashem? In other words, if we're going to use this concept of humility versus ego as a representation of doing what Hashem wants. So is it more valuable, or is it more meaningful when we do what Hashem wants because we're pushing ourselves, or when we do what Hashem wants because Hashem has inspired us, or because Hashem has done something that stimulates our behavior? Which one's better?
I think self-motivation is better.
Why?
Because you want to. It comes from within you.
Okay.
You want it right.
So the advantage of self-driven is that you own it. And that's probably one of the most meaningful things that can happen to people in their lives, is when they have the opportunity to own a meaningful process. So we have many examples of this, but specifically, let's say when you're raising children. So there are two ways that you could raise a child. You could give them everything, do everything for them, which makes you feel very good as a parent, makes it feel like you care, but doesn't empower them. So you've got a kid who's 30 years old, living at home, and his mother still brings him lunch to his office. Sounds very nice, sounds like a loving mother, but that paralyzes him. It doesn't allow him the opportunity to grow and develop as an independent, functional human being. So what's the advantage of something that is self-driven? You own it. If you own it, it's very personal. If it's very personal, it's very meaningful, and it is much more lasting. So you're right. The advantage of doing it ourselves is very powerful. So when we speak about the matzah from before Pesach, the matzah before midnight, that represents that the Jewish people had to do something.
Is that why we have shmura matzah?
Handmade matzah. That's the real. It can't just be a machine which is automatic. You've got to get involved and hurt your shoulders trying to make that matzah. So that's the one side of the story. Now let's try an argument for the other side of the story. Why would you potentially argue that it's much better if Hashem is the one doing it? So if Hashem is the one creating the humility or the inspiration or the connection, how could that be much better than when we're doing it on our own?
Shows you the connection of Hashem to us.
So that's true. Shows your connection. What else? There's a beautiful expression I will appreciate. It's a beautiful expression in Yiddish that when Hashem does something, es is hecher, it's much higher. When we do something, es is tayerer, it's much more precious. In other words, each one has an advantage. The advantage we have when we are self-motivated is ownership. And anytime you want an experience to be very personal, you need to feel that sense of ownership. But we are human after all. And humans, whether we are willing to acknowledge it or not, humans are highly limited beings. Which means, let's say for argument's sake that I'm going to be self-driven. Let's just use the example of humility. So I'm going to be self-motivated to learn how to become more humble. At the end of the day, there's a limit to how humble I could become. Because at the end of the day, I'm a person, and a person has a sense of self. And we're not talking about somebody who has an unhealthy self-esteem, that they feel like a doormat. That's got nothing to do with humility. That's just unhealthy. But at the end of the day, as the expression goes, Adam koroiv eitzel atzmo. It's a fascinating expression that the Gemara uses. Basically, the Gemara is talking about the fact that when it comes to testimony, you cannot bring a relative as a witness. And that's even if the relative is testifying against you. Where you think, you see, they're obviously not biased because they're arguing for the opposition. Still, halachically, you cannot bring a relative to testify against you. So then the Gemara says, Adam karov eitzel atzmoi. The closest relative you have is yourself. And therefore, you can never testify against yourself in a court of law. You can't, in today's world, it's considered a big deal if the police are able to get a confession out of a criminal. In Judaism, the minute a person confesses, it's inadmissible evidence. Because, right, if a person admits to a financial claim, that's one thing. But a criminal claim, if a person admits to a criminal claim, it's inadmissible. Why? Because Adam karev eitzel atzmoy. At the end of the day, we have whatever weird biases we have. No matter how much we believe ourselves to be humble, we still have a sense of self. Equally, in any other area of personal development, because the story of the Exodus from Egypt, as we very well know, is not just an historical event, but it's a representation of us breaking through any kind of major spiritual barriers to become a radically different, more developed spiritual person. So this matzah before midnight represents me breaking through a barrier of my own, and the matzah after midnight represents Hashem breaking me through a barrier. What I can do is going to be limited. So even let's say that I achieve something which I never believed I could achieve, which is what we call Exodus. At the end of the day, whatever I'm going to achieve is still going to be relative to my abilities. And my abilities, no matter how developed they are, no matter how talented I am, they still have their limitations. But if Hashem gives me a push, I could land up in an infinitely different reality. So the answer to the question is, both have an advantage and both have a disadvantage. The advantage of personal work is that I feel ownership and it's very dear to me. It's very personal to me. So therefore it's going to be more lasting and more effective, but it will have its limits. The advantage of Hashem's initiative is that it has no limits. So therefore it could go much higher. So now, when we eat matzah nowadays, does that matzah fall from heaven? Does that matzah just manifest because you put dough out and there's divine revelation and then the dough doesn't rise? No. The matzah that we have has to be manufactured. And again, if you go to the hand-baked shmura matzah bakery, which is something I feel every person should have the opportunity to do at least once in their lives, to actually make your own matzah. You know what an experience that is? It's difficult to do in the southern hemisphere because the seasons are wrong and you've got to hold the wheat for many months. It's not very practical. But conceptually, to be able to go make your own matzah. You'll never eat matzah the same. That experience of eating matzah that you produce with your own hands, something very, very personal. And before the advent of mass bakeries, that's how everybody made matzah. There wasn't a matzah shop that you used to go to. You got the ingredients and made your own matzah. So the matzah that we eat today, that is matzah that is human made. It's human manufactured, even if it's through a factory and it's machine baked. Some human has to supervise the machine. So therefore the matzah that we're eating today is pre-midnight matzah. That's the fact. And that's why we've got to eat it before midnight, because it represents the kind of matzah that is made by people. But there's one big, big difference. And that big difference is, first of all, unlike the Jews of Pesach, they did very little for their Judaism before that event. These are the big, as we say in the Pesach Seder, and I passed over you and I saw you wallowing in your bloods. Remember that line in the Seder? So I saw you wallowing in your bloods. And I said, by your blood you shall live, right? What are we talking about over there? We're talking about the blood that they had to put on the doorposts to mark their homes, and the blood of having a bris. So in a very short period of time, they had done a series of things to prepare themselves to leave Egypt. They had a bris, they slaughtered the Pesach offering and put the blood on the doors, and they had the Seder with the matzah. By the time we get to Pesach, we've done a lot more than that. Since last Pesach, we've davened, we've done mitzvahs, we've celebrated Yom Tovs. We've done a lot more of baking the matzah, so to speak, than what they did then. So even though our matzah is similar to their matzah in the sense that it's matzah produced through human effort, what we've done to make that matzah is far more than what they did to make their matzah back then. So we're starting at a higher level than what they did. Not only that, something fundamental changed between that Pesach and our Pesach. What fundamentally changed between that Pesach and our Pesach? This is a very important thing to understand about Judaism. Did they make matzah then because Hashem said so? Yes. It was a direct instruction. You've got to slaughter the Pesach offering and eat it together with matzah, which means they had to produce matzah. However, despite the fact that they had an instruction from Hashem, that instruction was very much a standalone instruction, which means at that point when they were told to make the Pesach sacrifice, was there Judaism? Did Judaism exist at that point?
Oh, no.
No. How do you know it didn't exist? Because we hadn't got to Sinai yet. We hadn't yet received the Torah. So something fundamental changed between that original Pesach and every subsequent Pesach. That original Pesach was before the revelation at Sinai, before the giving of the Torah. So therefore, the nature of what Hashem instructed them to do at that point was, I'm telling you what to do, and you have to do it on your own steam. That's basically what was happening. So Hashem says, I want you to make matzahs, then make matzahs. I want you to slaughter a Pesach sacrifice, then slaughter a Pesach sacrifice. But once Hashem gave us the Torah, any instruction that Hashem then gives in the Torah is fundamentally different to how it was before. Because what happened at the time of the giving of the Torah? You know, it's something that often confuses people. That when Hashem gave the Torah, people think, well, up until that point, nobody had that information. And now Hashem gave us that information. I mean, you know, surely that's kind of logical. That's how it works. It's not how it works. A lot of that information, and depending on who you were, possibly all of that information was already available before. Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, for example, we know, observed things that the Torah was only going to say in the future. Even to the radical extent that when the angels come to visit Abraham to tell him that he's going to have a son, Abraham is making matzahs. And the interpretation is that he already knew that was the date of the future Pesach, so he was already having a Pesach Seder before Pesach even happened. So they had insight into that information. The giving of the Torah is not the giving of information. Anybody who was spiritual enough had that information.
But, sorry, Rowan, and I know we learned yesterday that or we were reminded yesterday that there's nothing really chronological with the Torah. I'm just questioning because you said they had a bris. So between Abraham, or the 210 years in Egypt, they didn't circumcise the boys?
Correct. Many didn't circumcise. The tribe of Levi continued to circumcise their children. But many people did not have a bris from when they got to Egypt until this point. And that's why they had to have this mass bris ceremony in order to be able to leave Egypt. Okay?
Did you know that?
I'll throw something out that you can ruminate over. If you read the Haftarah on the first day of Pesach, it sounds like there was another period that the Jews didn't have a bris as well. And that was the period in the desert. Okay? You've got to ask yourself, for 40 years in the desert, it's implied in the Haftarah of the first day of Pesach that they didn't have a bris for 40 years in the desert, and you've got to ask why that is. But that's not for today. We'll have to leave that for another shir at another time. So what happened at the giving of the Torah? It says, there's a very interesting midrash that says, before the Torah was given, there was a decree that said, it uses a parable of a decree that says, the people of Rome were forbidden to ever travel to Syria, and the people of Syria were forbidden to ever travel to Rome. And then some king arrived, and he repealed that decree and said, now the people of Rome can visit Syria, and the people of Syria can visit Rome. So the Midrash says exactly the same thing happened at the time of the giving of the Torah, because before the Torah was given, as King David says in Tehillim, which we read in Hallel, which obviously we'll say on Pesach, Hashomayim Shomayim LaHashem. Heaven, that was exclusively Hashem's domain. V'ha'aretz nasan livnei Adam, and earth he gave to the humans. So it was exclusively the humans' domain. Which basically means this. Heaven is a place of holiness and a place of godliness. And earth is a place of materialism. So the original setup, the so-called decree, was that the heavens can never interact with earth, and earth can never interact with heaven. Which essentially means that the real holiness and the real godliness that Hashem has was inaccessible to humans. And the endeavors that humans would make could never reach the real holiness and godliness that Hashem has to offer. So if before the Torah was given you followed Hashem's instruction, it added benefit to you as a person. You became more spiritual, you became more sensitive, but that's where it ended. The world you lived in wasn't affected. The materials you used in order to do that mitzvah were not transformed in any way, and even your physical human form wasn't transformed. Your soul was elevated. What happens when Hashem gives the Torah is the marriage of the higher and the lower realms, the marriage of holiness and the mundane, the possibility that you could take a piece of parchment and turn it into a Torah scroll, the holiest thing on earth. That's what changed. So therefore, any mitzvah that occurs before Sinai, even though you're listening to Hashem's instruction and you're putting in your own effort, at the end of the day, all you could achieve with that mitzvah is whatever is in the range of your effort. So if you're a very spiritual human being like Moshe, then the experience you have when you make your matzahs and when you sit at your Pesach Seder is extremely advanced. And if you're a regular Jew who's been a slave for 200 years and never had a bris, and now there's this radical change happening in your life, but you really know nothing about it, then your experience of having the Pesach Seder and eating the matzah is going to move the needle just a drop, because you don't really have a frame of reference. You don't really have a spiritual sensitivity. Once the Torah is given, then when Moshe Rabbeinu eats matzah at the Pesach Seder, and when I eat matzah at the Pesach Seder, we both have an absolute experience of holiness. His experience of holiness is not greater than mine. Moshe's awareness of that holiness will be greater than mine, but his experience of holiness will be identical to mine. His matzah and my matzah will be the same. His tefillin and my tefillin will be the same. Which means that after the Torah was given, any mitzvah we do with our efforts, limited as they might be, has infinite value. Before the Torah was given, the mitzvahs I did had personal value. So depending on what person I am, that would determine how strong that mitzvah is, how transformative that mitzvah is. After the Torah was given, every mitzvah has infinite value, regardless of who I am. Which means that ultimately, nowadays, when we sit down to a Seder and eat matzah, which in turn represents many other areas of Jewish life, what we're doing is matzah before midnight, because we want to represent that it's us doing it. And therefore it's got to have the legal restrictions of the matzah that has to be before midnight, because it represents matzah that's made by human endeavor. But when we read the Haggadah and we say, why are we eating this matzah? We say we're not eating this matzah because of something we've done. We say we're eating this matzah because of something Hashem has done. Because in the same way as at the first Pesach, Hashem revealed himself, and that made a mega difference to the whole experience. Likewise, for us, everything about our Judaism is because Hashem revealed himself at Sinai, and that made a mega difference to our experience. In other words, by saying that we eat this matzah before midnight, which highlights that it's our effort, but we eat the matzah because Hashem revealed himself, which highlights Hashem's effort, we're illustrating that the matzah experience, and therefore by extension the Pesach experience, and therefore by extension the Jewish experience today, is a marriage of human effort with the turbo boost of divine input. Which means I take one step, and Hashem translates that step into an infinite value, because he's now given us himself through his Torah. And that's what we need to know at the Seder. We need to understand that the matzah we're having is a very simple food that was made by humans. And yet the matzah impact is absolute and infinite, because Hashem has given us a Torah. And today we eat matzah because the Torah says so. Not like in Egypt where they did matzah because they had a once-off instruction. And again, because Pesach is representative of the whole of Judaism, we have to appreciate that that's how the whole of Judaism is. So sometimes I get caught in thinking, what am I doing? It's just a little thing. You know, there's other people out there who know much more than I do, who do much more than I do. My little mitzvah, how much is it worth? It's worth infinite, absolute value, because Hashem has embedded himself in every mitzvah that we do and in every line of Torah that we learn.